thank you for joining us for another installment of UC3P's The Forum. Today's episode features our colleague Shivani Shukla interviewing Assistant Professor Eyal Frank about the intersection of ecology and economics. They dive into the blend of research, analysis, and creativity needed to explore and understand how humans impact the ecosystems that we live in. Let's join the conversation.
Hello, and welcome to The Forum. I'm a graduate student of public policy and your host for today, Shivani Shukla. My guest today is Professor Eyal Frank, an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. Eyal is also affiliated with the Energy Policy Institute at UChicago. As an environmental economist, he works at the intersection of ecology and economics. His work addresses three broad questions. How do natural inputs, namely animals, contribute to different production functions of interest? How do market dynamics reduce natural habitats and lead to declining wildlife population levels? And what are the costs, indirect ones in particular, of conservation policies? In his work, Professor Frank draws natural experiments from ecology and policy and uses econometric techniques to estimate different pieces of the puzzle regarding the social cost of biodiversity losses. The subject of our conversation today is mostly his intriguing research. Hello, Professor Frank. Welcome to UC3P. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Let's dive straight into the questions. We are all quite curious about the theme of your work, so let's start from the very inception. What journey led you to work at the intersection of economics and ecology?
So, broadly speaking, I think that we've all kind of seen or heard one way or another how ecologists tell us that species are in free fall, biodiversity is declining, we're losing species left and right. And the response that most people, that non-ecologists, have to this is, sounds bad, but so what? How is that going to impact me? And that's really the question that I wanted to be able to understand better, to understand what are going to be the social costs of these biodiversity losses. So just a short COVID disclaimer. You might hear me during today's talk coughing or my voice becoming a bit sore. I've just recovered from COVID. Don't worry, I didn't show up to the studio to infect everyone. I tested negative yesterday, but I still have a residual cough that's probably gonna hang out for another month with me.
Thank you for that answer. That's, I think, the crux to the next question. What led you to study environmental economics in such a multidisciplinary manner? What perspectives, other than economics, kind of drove you to study this intersection?
So I didn't start undergraduate knowing that I want to work specifically at the intersection of economics and ecology. I knew that I was interested in social sciences and natural sciences and the problems that involve both of them. Very quickly during the classes that I took as an undergraduate, I understood the important role that economics plays in decision making, and I understood that really understanding ecology and the importance of species and natural inputs is something that we don't understand well enough. And also when I went into undergraduate, I didn't think that I would end up getting a PhD, but seeing how little we actually understood about the intersection of those two topics made me really excited about the opportunity to contribute and extend our knowledge there.
Okay, let's go deeper into your research. And I know this is a jump from your undergrad journey, but would you care to share any projects that you're currently working on and the ones that you're super excited to start soon?
So there's one project that I've been working on for about a year or two, and it started out as sort of like a moonshot project in the sense that we had no idea if we were actually going to find something there, but the question was just so interesting, and the environmental change, or should I say catastrophe, was so overwhelming that we really wanted to understand if all of what we were hearing and seeing anecdotally can be seen in the data. So to just share a few more details, somewhere in the 90s and early 2000s, across the sub-Indian continent, there was a massive collapse of vulture populations. So think something on the order of magnitude between 30 to 50 million vultures within less than a decade, declining to just a few hundreds, maybe a few thousand of those millions of vultures. And you could think, okay, vultures are not exactly the definition of mega charismatic fauna. I don't want to run and hug them when I see them. They're like, let's keep a safe distance from one another. You know, they look like they're going to smell and they're dirty and sounds like potentially an improvement in terms of the environment and property values. Sounds great. What could go wrong? Well, turns out that vultures are really important because they're scavengers. Another way to think about it is they're the great sanitary workers of the environment. Another way to think about it is vultures are a way of spraying bleach over the environment because their stomachs are so acidic, like 100 times more acidic than ours, which means that they're the terminal stop for many bacteria and pathogens. So if vultures decline, and we lose that sanitation function, we should be very concerned as to what will happen in their absence. And people across India have said that in their absence, what we've seen is a massive increase in feral dog populations and a big increase in death rates and mortality, also due to water pollution. My co-author Anant Sudarshan and I took that question very seriously and went to the data to try and get data on health and data on where vultures were to kind of like back out what happened before and after the collapse in areas that were very suitable for the affected species and those that weren't. In a way, areas that suffered a collapse in vulture population relative to those that didn't. And what we found is that indeed there was a pretty sizable increase of close to 8 to 9% overall in death rates after the collapse, which sounds like a lot, but when taken under the consideration or through the lens of losing an entire ecosystem function, perhaps makes a lot of sense. We had a system that was so incredibly reliant on vultures, and they went away in just a few short years, and we didn't pay the price of substituting for them because it was so prohibitively expensive. And in a way, those areas went from having potentially low levels of pollution to very high levels of pollution.
It's quite intriguing. Talking of like another similar bird species, how about the northern spotted owl paper? Can we discuss that one? Because personally, I find that paper to be super intriguing, and that found a negative effect on employment. And what is the policy implication that we should like kind of decipher from these findings?
The northern spotted owl, I think, is a super fascinating case or like an iconic poster species when it comes to the Endangered Species Act. It was first listed in 1990, but even now in 2022, it is highly debated and constantly used as a precautionary tale about what happens to jobs and economic activity when we seek to place protections on the environment. So for over 3 decades, we've been fighting and arguing and like shouting at each other from different sides of the argument as to whether or not we have lost many jobs and have we decimated the logging industry in the Pacific Northwest. So when I was in graduate school, during my last year of the PhD, I had to come up with kind of like a last chapter for the dissertation. I had one that I wasn't happy using, so I was like, I have 3 weeks. I can write a brand new chapter during that time. The data are all publicly available. I know the methods. How hard can this be? So I went about starting to kind of like try and answer that question because I thought like, this is insane. We have the data on jobs by sector in the Pacific Northwest and outside of the Pacific Northwest, in the US and in Canada, in the logging sector and in other sectors. Why can't we just look and see? Are we talking about job losses in the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands? They're not zero. They're not infinite. We should have an informed discussion as to what was the impact of that protection. You know, many years after that, like I think it took 4 years to actually publish that paper that then became a joint paper with Anna Ferris that I later discovered also had a similar paper that she worked on in 2004. We realized that like, yes, there was some truth to the story that jobs were lost. Of course, we found about 30 to 32,000 jobs were lost in the logging sector, which is about a 28% decline if we compare the Pacific Northwest to the rest of the US. And that's a big estimate, but that's in no way anywhere close to what the logging industry was talking about, on the magnitude of like 120,000 and upwards of like close to 500,000 jobs would be lost in logging and other supporting sectors. So that kind of like, the bottom line of that paper was that, yes, logging jobs were lost in the Pacific Northwest, but not as much as the industry claimed that would be. And it's important that we manage to bound and quantify those losses. What proved to be sort of difficult in coming up with that answer is that during the time of the listing, we also had an economic recession in the 90s, so that complicates any inference about what happens to jobs. There are already all of these trends of just like technological change and a reliance on imports of timber. So how do you account for all of these kind of like undergoing secular trends in the data? And of course, the Pacific Northwest, in terms of its timber output and supply, is not necessarily one-to-one comparable with the Northeast or the Southeast. It's somewhat of a different forest. So how to account for that? No single comparison is perfect, but we produce many of them. Each one is better on one dimension, perhaps a bit worse on another dimension, but we always sort of get back to the same point, that same roughly 30,000 jobs, 28% decline.
Talking of data collection or data and methodology in general, I, for one, am very interested in how you kind of create novel data sets for all of these projects, or what is the kind of the primary data source that you use to kind of start putting together a paper?
Oh, that's a great question. Broadly speaking, I rely very heavily on secondary data sets. I basically do no fieldwork. I don't go out and measure animals out in the wild, and I definitely don't go out and manipulate populations at a large scale. Often when I give a presentation about my work, I start by saying we have to rely on natural experiments and quasi-experimental settings because no institutional review board is going to sign off on me going and randomly killing animals at a large scale to see what happens. It's just, just not going to fly. Beyond just like the other ethical and feasibility constraints, I will lose my job very quickly if I would suggest doing that. So I have to look along like historical timescales for things that happened that approximate what would be that kind of like large scale manipulation. I don't so much as like generate data as much as I kind of like read the literature, and my training in economics and ecology allows me to connect the dots. Like when someone hears about vultures collapsing in India, they think, oh, that's sad. I think, hold on, that's an identification strategy. When someone hears about bats in the US dying from this invasive fungus, they think, well, I never really liked bats, so whatever. I think, wait, this is the closest we're going to get to test all of the predictions from ecology, as well as the predictions from environmental economics as to what do people do when a natural input declines. In a way, my ability to connect those dots is what allows me to connect the different data sets that already exist and utilize them in a way that is potentially kind of like new and interesting. It's less my ability to generate new data.
It's quite interesting. Just talking of like the process, are there any dream projects that's on the back burner for you, or are there any collaborators that you're excited to work with in the future? There's so many kind of institutions working with wildlife at this point, but I've hardly ever seen like an economics kind of angle to any of those, and vice versa. Like even in economics, I've hardly ever seen ecology being kind of brought in a unique way like you do. So are there any collaborators that you have in mind?
I've always wanted to do something about whales. So to the listeners, you might not know this, but whales are really important in the ocean because essentially they fertilize the oceans. I'll leave the graphic details to your imagination, but essentially they consume a lot of biomass and they need to discharge it somehow. And as they do it over large scales in the ocean, they move nutrients from area to area. And that's really important to support all of the rest of kind of like marine ecosystems and life. So with whaling, with more shipping activity, with more disruptions to whales, we essentially risk disrupting or destroying a really important source of nutrients to the oceans. And the problem is that there's not great data on the location of whales. There's not great data on where exactly and how they travel. It's really hard to measure life in the ocean. I often joke that animals are like the worst survey respondents because they have like a 0% response rate when you send like a census form to them. With fish, it's even harder because they just like, they won't stay put. You don't know where they are. You don't know what they're doing down there. And measuring them from space or with vessels is really complicated at a large scale over long periods of time. So it's still one of kind of like my dream projects to be able to tell us we should really care about whales, not just because they're like, giant mammals in the water, because they sort of drive life in the oceans.
Mm-hmm. Following that, kind of panning out into the global scenario of ecosystems, what is the most critical ecological kind of disaster that's happening to us right now that not all of us might be aware of?
So we might hear of a lot of reasons as to why we're losing species left and right, but the first and topmost reason is habitat loss. At the end of the day, economic development usually comes at the expense of the environment. It's usually a trade-off. We're trading one unit of like high quality nature, process it and convert it to high quality human habitat, and whatever existed there before can't really exist there to the same degree they did before. Good, connected, pristine habitats are super important for the survival of species, and that is perhaps the biggest resource that we're kind of like reducing and taking away from ecosystems. If there's one thing that we need to focus on in order to like stabilize and stop the bleeding of biodiversity, is slowing down conversion of non-developed and untouched ecosystems and just let them be. And there are really big discussions as to what is that number. There was a book a few years ago by a super famous, renowned ecologist, E.O. Wilson, called Half Earth. He argued that we should put away half of the Earth aside for nature. Okay, now that's a really big number. 50% of the planet, humans shouldn't be on. There shouldn't be roads. There shouldn't be power plants. No subdivisions, no residential towers, nothing. It should be nature. That's going to be a tough sell in terms of a policy recommendation. So you have seen people adjust that number from 50% to 30%. And now the big slogan is 30 by 30, kind of like 30% of area should be protected by 2030. And that includes both terrestrial lands as well as marine areas. And there's nothing really scientific behind that number, okay? Just like there's nothing really scientific behind the 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius on average. It's a number we think we can achieve, and we can tie to some horizon that we won't be told that we failed to achieve it any day now, but we can still try and hold ourselves accountable.
Can you draw some parallels between climate policy and the urgency that everyone seems to understand and this ecological habitat loss? It's not understood quite as urgent, but it is happening. The climate policy sphere kind of seems to have taken over kind of the conversation about all of this. Can you draw some parallels so people are keener to work on the ecological aspect as well?
To me, there are many parallels between climate change and biodiversity losses. You might have heard me tell this story before, but when I was in graduate school, I was reading all the literature from ecology about declines in species, and I kept looking, okay, where is the number? Where is the number where you're going to tell me what happens to these outcomes that we care about when we lose that species or that other species, or when some biodiversity index declines by 10%. I never found it. And I had this big aha moment of wait, this is exactly where the climate change literature was 10, 20 years ago. We had the climate scientists saying climate change is happening, it's going to be bad, there will be high, potentially catastrophic costs to humanity and human well-being. And right now, we have ecologists saying, look, biodiversity is in free fall, this will not be good for human well-being, you should take this very seriously, but we still don't have the body of work in the social sciences that allows us to map that into socioeconomic outcomes. Mm-hmm. So in the same way, it took a decade or two for social scientists to start and build the knowledge and infrastructure and how to generate that information for how does a 1 degree increase going to impact our daily lives. And over time, we understand that a whole lot better, and we understand that those costs are very non-trivial. Mm-hmm. It's taking a longer time with ecosystems and biodiversity for a few reasons. I feel like only now we're starting to kind of get the same level of traction and attention for biodiversity losses as we do for climate change. We have had 6 reports by the IPCC. We have only had 1 report in 2019 by its equivalent body, the IPBES. That's one reason. The urgency is just more recent. The other reason, I think, comes to measurement and our ability to make inference and understand what's going on in this domain. With weather and climate, we are very quickly able to measure everything in terms of temperature, either in intervals of temperature or degree days or average temperatures or maximum temperatures, but some functional form or a transformation of temperature data, maybe also precipitation. But that's about it. That's how we think about weather and climate. When it comes to biodiversity, even in ecology, we still don't have an agreement about what is the correct way to measure biodiversity. And there are all of these different measures, all of them highlighting something different. Data on biodiversity is really scarce, both on a spatial and temporal scale. And it's a lot more complicated. It's this multifaceted puzzle of how do we connect declines in plants and animals to these outcomes that we're interested. How do we even measure the decline? How do we identify and understand the channels through which they will have an impact on these outcomes? And it's just a bit more of an uphill battle to generate that knowledge.
Connecting kind of both the global, I would call it a catastrophe, and your own research, kind of connecting both, what do you see your work's impact being in this sphere?
So I see my work trying to impact 3 major avenues. One is within economics, and especially within environmental economics. I want to show that thinking about biodiversity and thinking about natural inputs is important, not just theoretically, but also empirically, that we can quantify these costs and benefits of having less or more species using the same best practice techniques that we're using for other questions throughout applied economics. Mm-hmm. So that's one conversation I want to have. The second conversation I want to have is with ecologists, where they're very much focused on you either do work that is strictly theoretical or experimental in the lab or in the field, but in the field it's mostly going to be observational. This in-between quasi-experimental world doesn't exist that much in ecology. And I want to show them, look, we as a discipline, as economics, have developed all of these tools to work with messy real-world applications and settings, and we can still learn about all of the things you are telling us. Just because we don't necessarily think about measurement and inference in the same way doesn't mean that ecologists are wrong, but they're not able to have a conversation with economists because the tools and the techniques are just so different. Mm-hmm. So I want my work to be also a demonstration to ecologists on how they can use their amazing methods and data sets and real-world experience and ability to do great field work to then map it into this causal inference framework. Mm-hmm. And the third kind of audience I want to be reading my work are policymakers. I want them to have something tangible to discuss and understand in their discussions and be informed by these actual numbers. Another way of phrasing it is that if we fail to quantify the costs and benefits of biodiversity, it's not that we're going to implicitly assume that they're infinite. We're going to implicitly assume that they're zero. And there's always going to be some opportunity cost that's going to be non-zero. Mm-hmm. There's always going to be some economic project or some economic development that's on the table. We want to build another highway. We want to open another port. We want to approve this, great development of a new subdivision or anything like that. That can be measured in dollar terms more easily than the costs to biodiversity losses. Mm-hmm. And when we try and think about the trade-offs, we usually don't have good numbers to understand the biodiversity side of things. So I want my work to show that there is a cost, it is real, here are the magnitudes, here is also kind of like a way to apply these methods to be able to learn what those magnitudes are.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering what main barriers to action would you think about when you're presenting your work to policymakers and on the ground implementers, I guess?
So to be completely honest, I don't interact daily with policymakers. I think that a lot of what I try to do is more to just get my work published and then use the amazing communications team that we have here at Eyals and at Epic to kind of help me get that word out to policymakers and the press, and hoping that that gets picked up by interested stakeholders and advocacy groups and helps to inform the conversation. As unfortunate as it might be, my incentives right now are really to have a conversation within academia and to get the stamp of approval that I'm generating good and useful knowledge that is moving my discipline forward. Mm-hmm. Once I have that stamp of approval, then policymakers, when they ask themselves, we want to talk to someone who's an expert on the Endangered Species Act or is an expert about the value of a bat conservation or wolves conservations or scavenger conservations, when they Google that, maybe my name will pop up and then we'll have a conversation. In a way, I'm a bit too young and junior in my career to be pivotal and influential when it comes to the policy discourse. But it's a long game, and I'm trying to build up a body of work that will position me to be the person to come to when those questions arise.
How do you see the future looking like for non-human beings in a positive manner?
Oh, that's an interesting question. What's the vision of a world where we've found some equilibrium between society and nature? I don't think I have an amazing answer to this. I think it's mostly about just us recognizing that there is some importance and value in terms of preserving ecosystems, as well as preserving, perhaps more importantly, ecological corridors so that species can move and migrate and adapt to climate change.
Talking of human and non-human interactions, as you're working with kind of these agents that we don't quite see having agency in the real world, has anything changed with their own interactions with non-human beings that we share the earth with?
So I think that for a long time, people have placed some, value on different species, mostly on how charismatic and fuzzy and cute they are. Polar bears, panda bears often come to mind as species that at least I can't fully articulate why I care so much about them or what kind of benefit I derive from their existence, but I know it's a non-zero benefit. And I think that that kind of intrinsic value will tend to grow as societies become richer, because we think that our willingness to pay for nature and the preservation of nature and species becomes higher as we become richer. The problem is that we don't really have a good way on how to quantify and estimate those kind of existence values. I know I care about polar bears. Do I care about them at a $1 value, $5 value, $500 value? I don't know, and I also don't really know who's going to like ask me to write a check and who's going to ask me to like actually put down money on the table to preserve polar bears. There's not a really readily available institution that's going to collect that. One perhaps alternative, or like one, maybe a vision we can hope for in the future, is that we have some functioning form of payment for ecosystem services where we're able to get the benefits of collecting funds from people and get them to truly reveal their preferences and how much they're willing to pay without all of the kind of like negative detrimental aspects of biodiversity and payment for ecosystem services, where we're worried about like the inframarginal parts where people get paid to do stuff they were already going to do, and so on. We've worked on payment for ecosystem services for a really long time, and we still haven't been able to like really figure it out. I definitely don't have the answer for that, but maybe that's a way that we'll be able to kind of like elicit those type of monetary compensations.
Mm-hmm. One of my final questions was going to ask you more about sharing a hobby outside of work that you have. I wanted this to be like a scenario where one of us public policy students can see ourselves growing into, like growing into academia. And I was just wondering, after this rigorous work that you put out, how do you kind of decompress and not think about the environmental or global problems?
I like that question a lot. So I think that for a very long time, like since really when I was a kid, I've just really enjoyed going out, spending time in nature, not necessarily doing like something very active or like the sort of thing that would give you a big adrenaline rush. Just going out and hiking or camping, just spending time out in the woods, out in the desert, by a river, by a lake, just has always brought me like a lot of peace in mind and kind of tranquility. So I very much enjoyed that. And moving to the US, I've just found there are so many different environments to explore here, which in a way I understand why. I think the statistic is that like 50% of Americans don't have a passport because there's just like so much to see here. So that's something that I do. And maybe a bit of a habit that I picked up during graduate school was just not necessarily, training to run a marathon, but just having physical exercise be a routine thing that I do during the week, because it's something that is very different than the skills that I use in my day-to-day work, sitting frustrated in front of a computer screen. And it gets me away from a computer screen, and it makes me feel good about also just not neglecting my health in a way that will lead to a very awkward conversation with a physician in a few years. And so those are like the two things I try to incorporate in my life, like physical exercise on a somewhat daily basis, and not too long, 3-4 days at a batch, like out in nature.
It's actually not quite diverse from your own research work. I would say you're in the setting that you're studying behind a computer as well, which is kind of neat. Thank you for sharing that too. And with this, I think I'm at the end of my formal set of questions, and I would like to thank you for joining with us, UC3P, and this is going to be published as a written article as well. So thank you so much for that. For leaving words, would you want to share with us a book of interest or movie or documentary that you recommend? I remember you were talking about Princess Mononoke the other day.
I get less and less comfortable like mentioning how big of an impact Princess Mononoke had on me as I, become older. Like I'm almost 40 now, and I feel like saying when I was in high school watching Princess Mononoke, which is by far my favorite movie that I've watched a 2-digit number of times, like that realization, like the ability of that movie to articulate how complicated it is to decide what is the optimal boundary between nature and human progress and economic development, and how there are no necessarily classic villains in that story, and not necessarily like classic true good heroes. And that made me really interested in wanting to like that's where I want to be. That's the conflict. That's the friction. That's the dimension and the border where I want to work at and trying to contribute. When I was in high school, PhD was never on my mind. It came later, but if any of the listeners have not watched Princess Mononoke, I recommend you clear your weekend plans and find where you can stream it online. Other recommendations for books and movies, I've recently watched a fantastic documentary, I think called Fish and Men, which is a really good examination of the regulation and how marine fisheries are managed in the US. And other two books that I really like are by Elizabeth Colbert, that writes for The New Yorker. One is on climate change, one is on which is colloquially referred to as the sixth extinction. This like massive decline in biodiversity losses. I really like her writing because she does a really good job with diving into a specific story and then backing out and talking about the big picture.
Thank you, Professor Frank, for your time with us today, for sharing all of your insights, your research, and your thoughts on the global order as it stands.
Happy to. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us this week for The Forum. The Forum is a project of UC3P, the University of Chicago's public policy podcast network hosted at the Harris School of Public Policy. The Forum is produced by Sarah Luling, Ibrahim Rashid, and Colvan Glahn, with editing this week by me, Colvan Glahn. If you'd like to learn more or connect with UC3P or The Forum, please be sure to check the episode notes for all of our online handles and information. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation, and until we see you next time, I hope you keep being curious out loud. Take care.